The telegram arrived on August 7th, 1945, at 3:47 a.m. Berlin time. Werner Heisenberg didn't sleep anymore. None of them did. In the basement laboratory of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, surrounded by the skeletal remains of their uranium reactor experiments, he stood with trembling hands holding a decoded intelligence report. The words swam before his eyes, refusing to coalesce into meaning because the meaning was impossible. Hiroshima. Atomic bomb. Complete destruction. American. Otto Hahn burst through the door, his face ashen, waving a similar document. Behind him, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker stumbled in, looking like he might vomit. They had all received the same message through different channels, as if the universe wanted to ensure there could be no doubt, no hope that this was misinformation. "It's not possible," Heisenberg whispered. But even as he spoke, he knew it was. The calculations that had kept him awake for 3 years suddenly rearranged themselves in his mind. The Americans hadn't just built a bomb, they had detonated it. They had won a race that Germany's brightest minds hadn't even realized they were losing until this very moment. 6 years earlier, everything had seemed possible. When the war began in 1939, Germany possessed what many considered the finest scientific establishment in the world. The same laboratories that had given humanity quantum mechanics, the same minds that had revolutionized physics itself, now turned their attention to a new challenge, harnessing the power locked within the atom's nucleus. Werner Heisenberg, already a Nobel laureate at 38, led the Uranverein, the Uranium Club. The name itself was almost casual, as if they were meeting to discuss garden vegetables rather than weapons that could reshape the world. In the elegant seminar rooms of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, these men, Hahn, Weizsäcker, Walther Gerlach, Kurt Deibner, gathered to solve the puzzle that physics had presented them. They knew it was theoretically possible. That was the tantalizing part. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had discovered nuclear fission in 1938, right here in Berlin. They had split the uranium atom and watched as it released energy far beyond anything chemical reactions could produce. Lise Meitner, their Jewish colleague who had fled to Sweden, had been the one to truly understand what they had found. Her letters back to Hahn carried both scientific insight and an underlying current of warning, though whether she warned them about the physics or about what they intended to do with it, even she might not have known. 6 years earlier, everything had seemed possible. When the war began in 1939, Germany possessed what many considered the finest scientific establishment in the world. The same laboratories that had given humanity quantum mechanics, the same minds that had revolutionized physics itself, now turned their attention to a new challenge, harnessing the power locked within the atom's nucleus. Werner Heisenberg, already a Nobel laureate at 38, led the Uranverein, the Uranium Club. The name itself was almost casual, as if they were meeting to discuss garden vegetables rather than weapons that could reshape the world. In the elegant seminar rooms of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, these men, Hahn, Weizsäcker, Walther Gerlach, Kurt Deibner, gathered to solve the puzzle that physics had presented them. They knew it was theoretically possible. That was the tantalizing part. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had discovered nuclear fission in 1938, right here in Berlin. They had split the uranium atom and watched as it released energy far beyond anything chemical reactions could produce. Lise Meitner, their Jewish colleague who had fled to Sweden, had been the one to truly understand what they had found. Her letters back to Hahn carried both scientific insight and an underlying current of warning, though whether she warned them about the physics or about what they intended to do with it, even she might not have known. The mathematics were elegant, almost seductive. When a uranium-235 nucleus absorbed a neutron, it became unstable and split, releasing energy and more neutrons. Those neutrons could then split more uranium atoms, creating a chain reaction. If you could control that reaction, you had a power source. If you couldn't control it, if you let it run wild, you had a bomb. But theoretical possibility and practical reality existed in different universes entirely. The Germans needed uranium and lots of it. They needed heavy water to moderate the neutrons. They needed time, resources, funding, and most critically, they needed support from a military high command that couldn't decide if nuclear physics was brilliant strategy or academic fantasy. Hermann Göring called them ivory tower daydreamers. Heinrich Himmler wondered aloud if Jewish physics had corrupted their thinking. Even as Heisenberg tried to explain the potential, a single bomb that could destroy an entire city, the generals looked at him with barely concealed skepticism. They had Messerschmitts and Panzers and V-2 rockets. What did they need with theoretical physics? Still, the work continued. In laboratories in Berlin, Leipzig, and Haigerloch, scientists conducted experiments with uranium oxide and heavy water. They built experimental reactors trying to achieve a sustained chain reaction. They calculated and recalculated the critical mass needed for a weapon. And across the Atlantic, unknown to them, the United States had begun its own race. The Manhattan Project started with a letter. Albert Einstein writing to President Roosevelt, warning him that Germany might be developing atomic weapons. Einstein, another refugee from Nazi Germany, understood both the physics and the danger. That letter catalyzed something unprecedented, an industrial-scale scientific project with unlimited funding and a single goal. While German scientists debated with skeptical generals, America assembled an army of physicists at Los Alamos, New Mexico. While German experiments were hampered by Allied bombing raids and dwindling resources, American factories enriched uranium and produced plutonium on an industrial scale. While Heisenberg worked with a handful of colleagues in basements and repurposed buildings, Robert Oppenheimer commanded thousands of the world's brightest minds in a secret city built from nothing in the desert. The Germans had no idea. How could they? They assumed their lead in theoretical physics translated to practical advantage. They assumed the Allies faced the same challenges they did. They assumed wrong. By 1942, the pressure had become almost unbearable. Heisenberg sat in his office at the University of Leipzig, staring at equations that refused to balance. Outside, the city bore fresh scars from RAF bombing raids. Inside, the mathematics mocked him. The reactor experiments kept failing. They couldn't achieve a sustained chain reaction. Something was always wrong. The geometry, the purity of the uranium, the amount of heavy water, the configuration of the graphite moderators. In his desk drawer, he kept a letter from his wife Elisabeth. She had taken their children to the countryside, away from the bombing. "The children ask when you're coming home," she wrote. "I tell them Papa is doing important work. They're too young to understand what that means. Sometimes I wonder if I am too." He couldn't tell her the truth, that he didn't know if his work was important or futile, revolutionary or impossible. He couldn't tell her that every night he lay awake wondering if he was trying hard enough, or, and this was the thought that terrified him most, if some part of him was relieved when experiments failed. In Berlin, Otto Hahn faced different demons. He had discovered fission, but he hadn't intended it as a weapon. He was a chemist, not a weapons designer. Yet here he was, conducting experiments that could lead to unprecedented destruction. His Jewish colleagues had fled or been sent to camps. Lisa Maidner, his research partner of 30 years, was beyond his reach in Sweden. They still exchanged carefully worded letters that said everything and nothing. "I wonder," she wrote in early 1943, "what we intended when we began this work. I wonder if we understood the weight of what we were handling. Some discoveries cannot be undiscovered, Otto. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed." He burned that letter immediately after reading it. Keeping such correspondence was dangerous. But he couldn't burn the words from his memory. The technical challenges multiplied. They needed isotope separation to enrich uranium-235 from uranium-238, but the methods available, gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, required resources Germany no longer possessed. The Norwegian heavy water plant at Vemork had been sabotaged by British commandos in 1943. Their stockpile, painstakingly accumulated, now rested at the bottom of a Norwegian lake. Kurt Diebner, more pragmatic than the theoreticians, pushed for a military approach. Build what they could, even if imperfect. A dirty bomb that spread radioactive material rather than achieving a full-chain reaction could still devastate an enemy. But even that seemed beyond reach as Allied advances destroyed laboratories and scattered research teams. Rumors reached them through intelligence channels. The Americans were working on something. The British had evacuated their top physicists. Enormous facilities were being built in Tennessee and Washington state, consuming electricity in quantities that suggested industrial processes on unprecedented scale. But rumors were just rumors, and the Germans had their own propaganda to contend with. Half the intelligence reports were probably disinformation. The other half seemed too fantastical to believe. In June 1944, Heisenberg was summoned to a meeting with Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments. The conversation was surreal. Speer wanted to know, could nuclear weapons change the course of the war? Could they be ready in 6 months, a year? Heisenberg tried to explain. They were years away from even a prototype. The resources required were staggering. The technical challenges remained unsolved. A nuclear weapon wasn't something you could rush like increasing tank production. Speer listened with the expression of a man who had already decided. "Then we will focus on rockets and jets," he said. "Your work continues, but expect no additional resources." As Heisenberg left the meeting, he felt something unexpected: relief, and then immediately after, shame at feeling relieved. By early 1945, the work had become almost theoretical again. With laboratories destroyed and materials scarce, they conducted thought experiments and calculations. They trained students who would never use what they learned. They published papers that no one would read. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Heisenberg's protege and friend, sat with him one evening in February as artillery rumbled in the distance. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, American and British forces from the west. The Reich was collapsing. "Do you think they did it?" von Weizsäcker asked quietly. "The Americans?" Heisenberg didn't need to ask what he meant. "I don't know," he said. "If they did, we'll know soon enough." "And if they did," von Weizsäcker pressed, "what does that make us? Failures or the fortunate ones?" Heisenberg had no answer. The telegram that arrived on August 7, 1945, wasn't the first hint. There had been whispers the day before, garbled radio reports, something about Japan, something about a new type of bomb. But in the chaos of Germany's collapse, With communication networks shattered and everyone focused on survival, the reports seemed like just more noise in the cacophony of war's end. Then came the confirmation. By mid-morning, they had gathered in what remained of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. 10 men, the core of what had been Germany's nuclear program, sitting in a room that smelled of dust and defeat. Someone had found a functioning radio, and they listened to the BBC broadcast in English, translating for those whose English was weak. The announcer's voice was almost cheerful. President Truman announced today that American forces have successfully deployed a new weapon of unprecedented power against the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The atomic bomb, developed in great secrecy over the past 3 years, has caused devastation beyond anything previously witnessed in warfare. Otto Hahn stood abruptly and left the room. We could hear him being sick in the hallway. Heisenberg sat frozen, his mind racing through calculations. 3 years. The Americans had done it in 3 years. Not theoretical research spanning decades, but an actual, functional weapon in 3 years. While Germany's finest minds had struggled with experimental reactors and isotope separation, the Americans had solved every problem, overcome every obstacle, and built a bomb powerful enough to destroy a city. How? Kurt Deibener asked, his voice barely a whisper. How did they do it so quickly? The question hung in the air, but Heisenberg already knew the answer, or at least part of it. Resources, industrial capacity, freedom from bombing raids, collaboration without ideological interference. Everything Germany had lacked, America had possessed in abundance. Walter Gerlach, who had taken over scientific direction of the uranium program in 1944, looked like he had aged a decade in the past 10 minutes. "We were so close," he muttered. "We understood the principles. We knew what needed to be done." "Close means nothing," von Weizsäcker said bitterly. "Close is failure. They succeeded, we failed." Over the following days, more details emerged, each one a fresh wound. The bomb had released energy equivalent to 15 tons of TNT. A single bomb. The city of Hiroshima had been essentially erased. Casualty estimates ranged from 70,000 to 80,000 killed instantly, with many more injured and dying. And then 3 days later, it happened again. Nagasaki, a second bomb, this one even more powerful. They had 2. The Americans had built at least 2 functional atomic bombs and had been confident enough to use them. The implications cascaded through Heisenberg's mind like a chain reaction. If they had 2, they probably had more, or could build more. The Manhattan Project wasn't a desperate gamble, it was an industrial process. In the evenings, the scientists met quietly, away from any remaining military observers. They obtained copies of technical reports from Allied intelligence, documents that detailed the Manhattan Project's approach. As Heisenberg read through them, a sick fascination gripped him. The Americans had pursued multiple paths simultaneously: electromagnetic separation at Oak Ridge, gaseous diffusion at a facility so large it consumed more electricity than most cities, a plutonium production reactor at Hanford that made Germany's experimental reactors look like children's toys. They hadn't been trying to solve the same problems with limited resources. They had thrown virtually unlimited resources at every possible solution. And the scientists? The list of names read like a roll call of physics itself. Oppenheimer, Fermi, Teller, Bethe, Feynman, Lawrence. Not just Americans, but refugees from Europe, Germans, Hungarians, Italians, all fleeing fascism and then using their brilliance to defeat it. Scientists who might have worked alongside Heisenberg in different circumstances, building this weapon to use against him instead. Leo Szilard, Heisenberg said one evening, reading through the documents. "I knew him in Leipzig, brilliant man. He helped Einstein write the letter to Roosevelt that started all this. "Another Jew we drove away," Hahn said quietly. He had rejoined them, looking haunted. "How many did we send to America to build this weapon? How many could have been working with us instead?" The question was rhetorical, but someone answered anyway. Enough to matter. The psychological weight became crushing. They had devoted their lives to physics, considered themselves among the elite scientific minds of the world. They had stood at the cutting edge of quantum mechanics, revolutionized humanity's understanding of reality itself, and yet they had been comprehensively outmaneuvered, outworked, and defeated by an enemy they had underestimated. Worse, they couldn't even claim moral superiority. They had been trying to build the same weapon for the same purpose. The only difference was that they had failed. Von Weizsäcker found Heisenberg late one night staring at equations in the damaged laboratory. "Do you ever wonder," von Weizsäcker asked, "if we failed on purpose?" Heisenberg looked up, startled. "What?" "Not consciously, but deep down. Did we subtly steer ourselves toward failure because we knew on some level that we didn't want to succeed, that we didn't want to be the ones who gave Hitler this power?" It was a dangerous thought, perhaps even a comforting one. The idea that our failure represented unconscious moral choice rather than simple ineptitude. Heisenberg wanted to believe it, but honesty compelled him to shake his head. "No," he said, "we failed because they succeeded. That's all. We can't claim nobility in defeat when we pursued the same goal. We're not heroes for failing. We're just scientists who lost a race we didn't know we were running." As summer turned to autumn in 1945, the scientists found themselves in a strange limbo. The war was over. The Reich had collapsed. They were technically prisoners of the Allies, but treated more like guests, valuable guests, who needed to be debriefed, studied, and ultimately judged. The British moved 10 of them to Farmhall, an elegant country estate in England that served as a comfortable prison. The rooms were bugged, every conversation recorded, as Allied intelligence tried to understand exactly how much the Germans had known, how close they had come, and what they might do with their knowledge in the future. It was in these recordings, later declassified, that the true psychological unraveling became apparent. August 6th, the day of Hiroshima, caught them completely off guard. The initial reaction was disbelief. Some of them simply refused to accept that the Americans had succeeded where they had failed. It must be propaganda, they insisted, a psychological operation. No one could have built such a weapon that quickly. But as evidence mounted, disbelief turned to shock, then to something darker. "I wish I'd never heard the word uranium," Hahn said one evening, drinking more heavily than usual. The man who had discovered fission now faced the reality that his discovery had killed hundreds of thousands of people, that it would change warfare forever, that his name would be forever associated with this new age of potential annihilation. Heisenberg tried to comfort him. "You didn't build the bomb, Otto. You discovered a phenomenon of nature. You can't be held responsible for—" "Can't I?" Hahn's voice was sharp. "We all knew where this was leading. From the moment we understood fission, we knew, and we pursued it anyway. For Germany, for the Reich, for Hitler." He spat the last name like poison. The recordings captured Heisenberg's response, a long silence, then a quiet admission. "We tried. God help us, we tried." That was perhaps the most devastating realization. They couldn't claim they had sabotaged their own work or deliberately slowed progress. They had genuinely tried to build an atomic bomb for Nazi Germany. They had simply failed. And now, in failure, some of them wanted to claim moral credit they hadn't earned. In his private moments, or as private as moments could be in a bugged house, Heisenberg wrote letters to Elizabeth that he knew couldn't be sent. Letters that would be read by Allied intelligence. Letters that were really confessions to himself. I don't know what we were thinking, or perhaps I do know what it is, and that's worse. We thought we were serving Germany, serving science, serving human knowledge. We told ourselves that the physics was neutral, that the equations didn't care about politics. But equations don't build bombs, people do, and we were those people. The Americans succeeded where we failed, and I find myself feeling, what? Relief? Shame? Both? If we had succeeded, Hitler would have possessed a weapon of apocalyptic power. We would have given it to him, perhaps reluctantly, but we would have given it. And then what? What would he have done with it? What would we have become? The letter remained unfinished. Von Weizsäcker, younger and perhaps more willing to engage in philosophical gymnastics, tried to construct a narrative of noble failure. We were too ethical, he suggested during one recorded conversation. The Americans had no moral qualms about building such a weapon. We did. That's why they succeeded and we failed. Gerlach, usually mild-mannered, exploded. That's horseshit, Carl. Horseshit! We failed because they were better organized, had more resources, and worked harder. Don't dress up our failure as virtue. We wanted the same thing they wanted. We just couldn't achieve it. The argument that followed revealed the fault lines in their collective psyche. Some wanted to believe they had been secretly moral, unconsciously sabotaging a weapon they knew shouldn't exist. Others insisted they had been true believers who had simply been outmatched. A few, like Gerlach, refused any comforting narrative and faced the stark truth that they had tried to build a weapon of mass destruction for a genocidal regime and had failed for entirely prosaic reasons of resources and industrial capacity. Deibner, always the most practically minded, summed it up bluntly. We were brilliant at theory and terrible at engineering. That's the whole story. The Americans figured out that building a bomb wasn't a physics problem. It was an industrial problem. They treated it like building tanks or ships, just with more complicated blueprints. We treated it like an academic research project. We lost because we misunderstood what kind of race we were in. But perhaps the most haunting moment came from Otto Hahn. Late one night, after too much wine, his voice captured clearly on the hidden microphones. Do you know what keeps me awake? Not that we failed, not even that they succeeded. It's that I'm glad we failed. I'm glad Hitler never got this weapon. And that gladness makes me realize that some part of me knew all along exactly what we were doing and what it meant. I knew, and I did it anyway. And I'm only glad about the outcome because we failed. What kind of scientist does that make me? What kind of man? No one answered. What answer could they give? Decades later, when the documents were declassified, when the farm hall recordings were released, when historians could finally piece together the full story, a different picture emerged, one more complex and less comfortable than simple narratives of good and evil, success and failure. The German nuclear program had never been truly close to building a bomb. This was the painful truth that emerged from careful analysis, not because of moral restraint or deliberate sabotage, but because they had fundamentally underestimated what the task required. They had approached nuclear weapons like a theoretical physics problem when it was actually an enormous engineering and industrial challenge. Heisenberg had made crucial errors in calculating the critical mass of uranium needed for a weapon, errors that led him to believe far more uranium was required than was actually necessary. This miscalculation shaped the entire German program's approach, making the task seem even more impossible than it already was. Whether this was an unconscious sabotage or simply a mistake remains debated by historians, but the effect was the same. It helped ensure German failure. The Manhattan Project, by contrast, brought together theoretical brilliance with American industrial might and organizational skill. Over 130,000 people worked on the project at its peak. Entire cities were built in secret. Factories consumed staggering amounts of electricity and resources. It was perhaps the largest scientific undertaking in human history. And it succeeded because it treated the atomic bomb not as a physics puzzle, but as a crash program of industrial production. But the deeper irony, the one that haunted Heisenberg for the rest of his life, was more personal. In 1941, at the height of German success, Heisenberg had visited his old friend and mentor, Niels Bohr, in occupied Copenhagen. The meeting went badly. Heisenberg tried to discuss the ethical implications of nuclear weapons, perhaps seeking absolution or guidance. Bohr interpreted it as Heisenberg confirming that Germany was actively pursuing a bomb, and left the meeting shaken. That conversation, shrouded in ambiguity and later controversy, may have helped convince Bohr to eventually join the Manhattan Project. So, Heisenberg's attempt to engage with the moral complexity of nuclear weapons potentially helped recruit one of physics' greatest minds to build the very weapon that defeated Germany. The irony was almost Shakespearean. And what of the what-ifs? What if Germany had succeeded first? The scenarios are chilling. Hitler, possessing atomic weapons in 1944, might have used them against London, Moscow, and any other city that opposed him. The war might have ended very differently. The Holocaust might have continued unchecked. The moral calculus of nuclear weapons, already troubling, becomes even darker when imagined in Nazi hands. But there's another what-if that historians discuss less often. What if Germany had never pursued nuclear weapons at all? What if Heisenberg and his colleagues had simply refused, had claimed the project was impossible, had deliberately failed from the start? The question haunted Heisenberg. In his memoirs and interviews late in life, he sometimes suggested they had done exactly that, had protected humanity from Nazi nuclear weapons through subtle sabotage and deliberate incompetence. But the evidence doesn't support this comforting narrative. The farm hall recordings catch them genuinely shocked that the Americans succeeded. If they knew how to build a bomb and deliberately avoided doing so, the shock would have been feigned. It wasn't. They failed because they genuinely couldn't succeed, not because they chose not to. And yet, the moral question remains: should they have tried harder? Should they have tried less? Can you claim moral credit for failing at evil, or does the attempt negate any such claim? Otto Hahn, who lived until 1968, spoke rarely about his wartime work. When he did, he focused on the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the burden of having discovered the science that made such weapons possible. He won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1944 for the discovery of fission, a prize awarded while he was detained by the Allies, accepted in a world that had just learned what fission could do. Heisenberg, who lived until 1976, never fully escaped the controversy. Some portrayed him as a hero who deliberately sabotaged the Nazi bomb program. Others saw him as a failed weapons scientist who constructed a post-war mythology to justify his actions. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative. In the end, history was shaped not just by what happened, but by what didn't. The atomic bomb entered the world through American hands rather than German ones. And while the moral complexities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continue to be debated, few doubt that atomic weapons in Hitler's hands would have been catastrophically worse. The Nazi scientists, brilliant and flawed, ambitious and conflicted, did not change the course of the war. They watched from the sidelines as history turned without them, as their genius proved insufficient against American industrial might and organization. They faced the peculiar agony of knowing they had tried to build a weapon of mass destruction and failed, leaving them unable to claim either the glory of success or the moral high ground of deliberate refusal. They were men who learned too late that some races cannot be run with brilliance alone, that moral clarity sometimes comes only in hindsight, and that failure can be both a relief and a shame. The lab in Haigerloch, where Germany's experimental reactor sat silent and unfinished when American forces arrived in 1945, stands now as a museum. Visitors can see the cave where uranium cubes hung from wires, where German scientists conducted their final experiments as the Reich collapsed around them. It's a monument to ambition unfulfilled, to the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical achievement, to the unpredictable paths history takes. And somewhere in the archives, on slowly degrading magnetic tape, the voices of those scientists can still be heard. The shock on August 6, 1945, the disbelief, the slow realization, the moment they understood that history had passed them by, that their race was already lost, that their genius had not been enough. Heisenberg's voice says on the tape, tinny and distant across the decades, "They did it. God help us all, they actually did it." The tape hisses, silence follows, and in that silence, everything changed.